Now,
Yeah.
you've argued, and I think you've already alluded to it, that it was technology that weaned the US off this familiar idea of the formal empire,
Yeah.
right? And how, I think you've mentioned this, how the US owns this extraordinary suite of technologies that gave it many of the benefits of empire without having to actually hold colonies. Right? That's
Yeah.
exactly what
Yeah.
we're talking
Yeah.
about. You don't need that much territory now to hold, even for the economic benefits that you need, or to culturally influence populations. It's much easier to do that now technologically than it was, let's say, for the British 200 years ago, 250 years
Yes.
ago. Right? So now the question that raises, and this is not so much a topic of conversation maybe in the US or Europe, but that's partly the reason I wrote the book from a very global perspective, was as you think about countries like India in the great tech game, and this era that, we're seeing this era of technological competition between countries, hyper competition almost. There's this fear, and there are parallels being drawn very quickly. And you mentioned now you've spent time in India, so I'm sure you've seen some of this. There are very quick comparisons that are often made the moment there's a large foreign entity that comes in and becomes powerful in a country like India.
Yeah.
Or big in India. Immediately there are parallels drawn, not just by politicians and policymakers, but even by citizens and, regular folks, to the East India Company.
Yeah.
The moment data is being not stored in India, right, by the big tech firms, there's parallels being drawn that, listen, this is the new land grab. Data grab is the new land grab. So if the East India Company and the British Empire were all about land grab, now we have what people call the data grab. That big tech firms are basically grabbing the data that is owned by the billion plus people of India, and that's not fair. That's extractive. That's a new form of colonialism, data colonialism, digital colonialism. Right? So now, tech firms operating in India have to now deal with this idea and this perception that they are new tech empires, right? And so I want to talk about tech empires in the same vein as we've been talking about, the British Empire and the American Empire. And again, with the caveat that I don't necessarily believe that they are the same kind of empires or the same kind of entities as, the East India Company or the British Empire. But just like the US had to adapt to the idea of empire, I believe tech firms, being global firms, bigger, stronger, more influential than the East India Company, for example, or the Dutch East Indies Company, have to deal with this idea, at least in countries that have been colonies in the past, of this idea of tech empire. And so I want to ask you this. Are tech firms also empires in hiding?
Yes.
And as they think about their global influence, what are they going to learn from how the US has managed its global influence?
Yeah. So you can see why people's minds go to the East India Company, because there was this, the early moment of European empire was counterintuitively not a moment of really the extension of state power. It was through corporations. That's true in India. That's also true in the country where I am right now, the United States, right? It was like the Virginia Company, and like all the early colonization was handled by corporations that were licensed.
They were called, venture capitalists, and someone in the venture capitalist world. And as I'm reading about this history, right, I was like amazed by the parallels between venture capitalists today and sweat equity given to entrepreneurs, and the way equity and sweat equity is given to these adventurers who are going off and capturing new lands and capturing new markets and territory, right? Crazy.
Yeah. So the early history of empire is really, the history of what the historian Philip Stern calls the company state. And we're so used to that kind of 19th century model of, Britannia rules the waves kind of thing, that you have to remember, you're like, oh, wait, the first century of British colonization in India wasn't technically British. It was a company doing it, right? It wasn't the British, Like they were Britishers, but they weren't, you know, so like you have to like kind of like think through that. And I think it's really easy to just be like, whatever, they're just British, doesn't matter. But actually there was an enormous amount of tension between the corporations and the crown around all these issues. So I don't think it's like straightforwardly just, you know, well, they're just British, either they're flying the flag or they're not. And we're in an interesting moment where, in terms of, you know, like land grabs, the great powers are not doing that through their government. Like that is not happening. However, we are also living in an age of all kinds of land grabs through special economic zones and all that kind of thing, including in India, that are happening through corporations that are like sort of have the like license of the Indian state, but you know, not necessarily, it's not necessarily like the popularity of the program throughout the whole populace. So I think it's a good moment to both like reflect on the decline of state centrality in sort of projects of control, and then also to like go back to those earlier moments when the state was relatively weak. I mean, I think we're basically looking at, you know, if you want to tell the history of empire and the state, you start off with weak state, strong corporations, you get to strong state, and then you arrive again at where we are, which is relatively weaker states and stronger corporations, or states that act through corporations, with always the danger that the corporations will distort the mission of the state.